Hello, everyone, and welcome back to CODEstantine Meetups. My name is Bratislav, and I'll be your host of today's meetup. Today, we will have a talk / demo, and it will be quite a ride since we'll be talking about Firebase and building web application using Firebase. As you may know by now, CODEstantine is a developers community founded in Serbia and expanding further with every CODEstantine meetup every single new week. We strive to gather top developers and experts to talk about a variety of different topics. This is the 5th CODEstantine meetup with many more to come in the upcoming weeks. You can check our website, CODEstantine.com, for more details about the speakers and the talks. So CODEstantine is actually organized by No Limit Hub from Serbia, and that's a community organization that has been working on strengthening entrepreneurs, startups, and tech community. Our guest today is Michael Dowden. Michael, welcome aboard. And really thank you for taking the time to join us today and share your vast Firebase experience. I would like to say just a quick word about Michael. So Michael is an international keynote speaker who is Google developer expert in Firebase and Microsoft MVP in developer technologies, and also the CEO of Andromeda. I hope I pronounced that right. And that's a company that focuses on product development and social sustainability. So today we'll be playing with fire, as the topic implies, and Michael will show us how easy it can be to use Google Firebase to take your app idea from concept to production. Michael will build a messaging application showing all the steps required to launch a new serverless web application with Firebase. So this will basically be a demo session, and you guys have two options. You can just relax and watch Michael do his magic, or follow his instructions and do it by yourself in real time. And all you need for this is a Google account. Also, I'd like to encourage the audience to ask as many questions as they want and to be active in the chat. That's about it. Michael, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen here really quickly, and we'll get started. So I have a few slides to go through, and then I will walk you through. If you want to join along, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, we'll do this together. So thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm really excited to be here with you. I'm really excited to talk about Firebase. This is something that I do regularly as part of my job. It's something I enjoy doing a lot and building applications. So let's get started. So some of the goals that I have for this demo is I want to introduce to you the key features of Firebase. Like, what is Firebase about? What are some things you can do with it? How to get started. And then we're going to actually build an application, and I'm going to demo some of the Firebase tools along the way so that you'll kind of understand how those work, and you'll be able to do your own project with Firebase. So first, what is Firebase? Firebase is, a lot of people refer to Firebase as just a database or as a serverless platform, but really Firebase is a comprehensive development platform. It offers service applications, serverless hosting. The features include 2 different serverless databases, authentication, file storage, hosting, serverless functions, and a whole bunch of tools to improve your app quality, grow your business. You can build a whole business off of Firebase. In fact, I've kind of done that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. One of the criticisms we hear when we talk about Firebase a lot is people are under the impression that it's just mainly meant for bootstrapping and prototyping and not really built for real world applications, and that it doesn't scale. And that's simply not correct. It is very good for bootstrapping and prototyping because it's so quick and easy to get an application up and running, but there's still a lot of enterprise level companies using it in their solutions. And I have a parking startup that I have been running on Firebase platform myself for five years now, called FlexiPark. But some numbers: Alibaba.com, 552 million active users, right? Duolingo, they update their database, thousands of times per second. Lyft provides tens of thousands of rides per day. and Shazam has over 100 million monthly users on over 500 million devices. And some of these numbers are a little dated. Some of these have increased since then in the last couple of years, but you see some real scale on Firebase. So I was already introduced. Here's just kind of a quick timeline. I've been doing software for a really long time. And as we've mentioned, I do have my own company doing consulting in Firebase. So that's how I learned how to do this stuff, quite frankly, was honestly just from building my very first application. I kind of stumbled into Firebase a little bit because we wanted to build an application, really didn't want to manage servers, and I was looking for a data solution at the time, and Firebase came up and we tested it and we just never looked back. So one thing that I want to show you is the Firebase console. There's a lot of things about Firebase that you can manage through the web, and so I'm going to show you this and kind of navigate around what do you see when you log into the Firebase console. So let me switch views, and here is our Firebase console. So when you come into the console, like I have a bunch of different projects, right? You can click here to add a project. If you go to console.firebase.google.com, you can sign in with your Google account. You get right here, you'll be able to add a project. I'm going to show you the project that I already have, which is right here. And there's a few things that you're going to notice. First are the sections. So you've got these different categories. Engage has a lot of tools to be able to work with your users after your product is launched. This includes things like A/B testing, right there built in. You've got remote config, and this ties into A/B testing. It allows you to do, for example, feature flags. You can set a parameter for a subset of your users, a lot of different things. You can manage ads in your apps. Dynamic links is a really exciting feature where you can set a custom URL prefix and you can create your own. Basically, if you do bit.ly and you have bit.ly links or your own custom short links, you can do that. But you can actually create a dynamic link straight into a web app, straight into an Android app, straight into an iOS app. It can work across all of those three to get people into your products through a web URL. And they're super exciting. You can add all kinds of things to them. So that's really, really useful to managing your traffic. We also have analytics, and Firebase Analytics recently added support for the web apps. So if you were normally using Google Analytics, you can still do that. You can still use Google Tag Manager and all those things, but you can also add analytics straight inside of Firebase. And it's really quick and easy to set up because it's part of the platform, and you'll be able to kind of see a lot of your analytics types of things. You can set up funnels and audiences. When you set up your audiences here, it affects what you can do down here in your A/B testing and your remote config, for example. So all these things really work together all in one. And so Firebase is like a subset of the entire Google ecosystem in a lot of ways, designed specifically for deploying and running apps. So once you're up and running, Crashlytics does not yet support web apps. Right now, it is only for iOS, Android, and Unity apps, but it allows you to monitor errors that happen on your apps. If you want to monitor errors on your web application, what we use typically is a third-party product called Track.js that manages error tracking for JavaScript apps in the browser. There are a couple of other tools here. These tools are primarily for Android and iOS apps right now, but they're very much working on adding web app support to those. So depending on the types of apps you're doing, you may or may not be able to use their built-in release and monitoring tools. Now, note that anything that you do inside of Firebase is part of the Google Cloud Platform automatically. So anything you can do in the Google Cloud Platform, like log tracking, you can totally do as part of Firebase. There are a handful of machine learning plugins. Again, this is something that doesn't really work well with the web and is primarily designed for app development. Of course, if you're in the web, there's a large array of APIs you can manage. And this is where we get into the stuff that I'm really going to show off during this talk today. I'm just going to work them backwards. So the first one is functions. So we'll be able to deploy cloud functions, and these are standalone serverless microservices, essentially, that can be run and deployed individually. They can spin up and down, and we'll get into some of the details, but you can manage all kinds of things. You can see how they've been using, what do the logs look like, do we have any errors, what is my traffic on those. You can access your hosting. You can see when the last deploys were done, see the traffic, see how much has been downloaded, how much you're using in your storage, all these different things. You can see your files. You can actually browse it like a file system. If you have a real-time database, you can see that here. If you have a Firestore database, you can see that here. You can actually browse it and interact with the data. You can also see your authentication. You can see the people that have authenticated. You can see the different providers here. And then there's a project overview. And this is where we're going to do some setup stuff in a little bit. Actually, let's go ahead and do that now. So let me switch back to these slides really quick. And let me introduce you to the CLI, and then we'll actually get started with setting up a project. So the Firebase command line interface allows you to do a lot of really great things. And let me, make this a little bit bigger for you. There we go. So the Firebase CLI allows you to initialize a new project. So when you do Firebase init, it'll actually create the configuration things that you need in order to be able to run your project locally. That includes being able to set up and download emulators to be able to run your project. You can do a CLI login, which is how you do authentication so that your CLI is working with your account or accounts. You can see your available projects. So for example, if I do Firebase projects list, it's going to show me all the different projects that I have available, all the ones that I've done. I can use serve and deploy. Serve allows me to run locally. Deploy allows me to push to a public server. So this is an Angular project. So if I do, actually, make sure that I run the right commands. Yep, it's just build prod, and yep. So I can do this, and it'll actually do a build and then run it inside of the Firebase server, and I'll show that to you here in just a second. There's a lot of other things you can do. You can import and export user accounts. So you could do some user account management through the CLI instead of through the API if you prefer to do it that way. You can actually do some database manipulation, depending on if you're using real-time database or Firestore. And you do, because of the different things you can do, it allows you to set up script support for your maintenance operations. It allows you to do a lot of things with your CI, CD, and your DevOps. So really like using the Firebase CLI. It's a really important part of running projects. So theoretically, this should be up and running now, and I'll give you a quick walk through what that looks like. So we are on localhost 5000. And we're up and running. There's nothing to show yet because we haven't really built the app yet. So if you would like to follow along with me, I'm going to paste this here in the chat. And this is the URL to the code that I'm working from. What you're going to want to do is grab the starter branch. So if you come out there, you'll be able to, if you go to this location, obviously you can grab your code here to be able to clone the repository, and then you want to check out the starter branch. The complete branch is already done, so that's not very exciting. The starter branch is going to be what we're going to work through to kind of build up this project. And the reason I do this for demos like this is that it can take a lot of time sometimes to design your HTML and your CSS and everything, and that's not really the point of what I'm trying to showcase here. And so all of that stuff is already here in the project, and we're just going to write the Firebase bits. If we were going to do this from scratch, I'm going to come up here really quickly. Generally, what I would do, if I'm doing an Angular project, which is what I'm going to show you here today, it doesn't matter if you're using Angular, React, or just a vanilla JS, Vue. There's really good Vue support for Firebase. What you can do, obviously, is I can create a new, no, ng new. So I'm just going to take all the defaults for right now, and then we're going to show off how the Firebase CLI will do its setup. Generally, you can actually create a brand new Firebase account using the CLI once you've logged in. I generally go through the dashboard here to create the new account. I'll go out here and add to the project, and then I'll select that project from the CLI. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of those is when you set up a project, you're going to need to be able to set up your zones and things, and that doesn't always work that well from the command line. So you need to be able to set up an app. And if I click on my app here within my project, where are we? There we go. Default resource location. So you have to set default resource location. Right now I'm in the United States, so I've got US Central. There's others around the world depending on where you are. So you'll be able to kind of choose the location that makes sense for you. And you can do that in here. It's a little bit trickier to do that from the CLI when you're just getting started. So I created this in an example, and there's the Angular project. So I'll do Firebase in it. I'm already logged in, and now I get to pick, what do I want to do? I want to use Firestore. So I'm going to use these keys to navigate, the arrow keys, and then the spacebar to select. I want functions, I want hosting, storage, and I definitely want emulators. And let's go with that. And it's going to say, do you want a new project or an existing project? So I'll go ahead and use our existing Fireside project, and it's going to ask me a bunch of questions about the files I'm going to use. I'm going to just take the defaults, except I'm going to use TypeScript for functions. Now let's not bother installing the dependencies right now. There we go. What emulators? Let's just go ahead and set them all up. There we go. And really quickly, I'll show you what just happened in this thing. So just running Firebase in it, going through and answering some questions. Now I have this Firebase JSON file, and actually this public isn't going to be correct. It's actually going to be this example. This is because we're in Angular land, and Firebase, the default was public, and I should have changed it there. So this is just a default Firebase project file, basically. It gives the things about Firestore, the functions, the hosting, it sets up all my emulators so I can run things locally. And so this is fun if I actually run the emulators. And if you ever have a question about how the command line works, because I can never remember this command, it's Firebase help and Firebase emulators. Nope, I don't want to download. I haven't downloaded it yet, so I'd have to download them, and then once I've downloaded them, then it's going to tell me that I'm able to run them. So I'm not going to do that right now, but you can absolutely run emulators of the entire environment right here locally, which allows you to test all the things you're doing. The one caveat to the emulators is that when it runs the database, it runs the database empty. And the first couple times you do that, you're going to be like, why is nothing working? Well, it's because the data that you're expecting to be there isn't actually there. And so that's how the CLI works, and that's how it would work if we're setting up a project from scratch. But we are using an existing project. As I mentioned, we're using this one right here. And so I'm going to go ahead and show that off here. And we're going to close the example. And I actually have the code open right here. We're going to start working through it in this space. Here is the actual Firebase initialization script that I have in this project. I've customized it just a little bit. As you'll see, my public is here. That's because that's the Angular build location. I've got a couple rewrites going on. This one right here, this is the stock rewrite for single page apps. Basically, it's saying anything that I can't match needs to go to the index.html, and that allows Angular, React, or whatever to run it. Then we have some headers. This is the Angular cache header. This is my custom cache header for my app assets, for my static files. And then I have a whole bunch of different security headers, that sort of thing. Feature policy is actually outdated now. I need to update that. Refer policy, robots, etc. We do this right here because this is a demo app. I don't want Google indexing it. Yeah, so that is the basic setup of a brand new project. So if you have grabbed this, if you have git cloned my project, and check out the starter, that's where I already am, and that's going to allow us to get started. Switch back here really quickly. We now have a project started and set up. Again, basically use your platform setup and then your Firebase in it. So another thing that Firebase has to offer is authentication. There's a lot of different authentication providers to choose from. These are really easy to work with. And we're going to set a couple up really quickly. But it is incredibly fast to set up your OAuth type of third-party authentication using Firebase, and you don't even have to write any code for it, really. And so that's the first thing that we're actually going to set up. So coming back into the project, actually, let's go to the authentication out here first. So sign-in methods. The first thing you're going to need to do before we can actually do any sign-in is you're going to have to enable your sign-in providers right here inside of your web console. Email password is a pretty easy one. You can do a normal email password, or if you prefer, you can do email with a passwordless option. If you enable this, it will use passwordless email links to your inbox to be able to log in with that password. The other thing we can do is if you have a Google account, which obviously you do, because otherwise you wouldn't be here in the Firebase console, you can enable Google authentication in your apps literally just by clicking the enable button, and it does all the other provisioning behind the scenes that's necessary. If you want to use a different one like Facebook, you'll actually have to go to the Facebook Dev Console, generate your app ID, etc., and then enable it here with those parameters. So we're not going to do that today just because I don't want to deal with all the Facebook part of the setup, but you could totally do that. One thing to note is some of these, like Twitter, for example, doesn't provide you with the email address. A lot of the others are email based. Twitter is not. So there's some heavy lifting on your end potentially, depending upon which of these you're using, if you want to normalize the accounts against an email address or whatever. You'll have to do some of that programmatically, especially if things like phone. You can do a mobile phone login. This literally allows people to log in using just their phone number. The SMS and everything is built in. And this is just literally toggle it on and you'll have access to it. Another thing to point out about sign-ins is that if you have any custom domains that need to be able to host on or log in on, you're going to have to add them here as an authorized domain. But not just there, inside these templates, there's email templates. So if you customize your domain, you're actually going to want to customize these to link to the correct domain. And these are the emails or the SMS that will go out for your different things people request. If they need to verify their email address, need to reset their password, these are the automated emails. So all those authentication related emails are completely built into the Firebase platform and automated. You can customize them however you want, including the domain that they link to and that they send from. So right now we have enabled the email password and the Google authentication, and that's going to allow us to actually write the code now that we need to write. So if we come in here in our project, I have already created in here a couple different modules. So we're going to come into the core module, and the first thing we're going to have to do, we're going to use the Firebase UI. And in this particular case, I'm using the Firebase UI Angular package because that provides some really nice Firebase UI wrappers for Angular. But what Firebase UI is, it's essentially a web component that does all of the UI parts of auth. So it'll show you all the login links, it'll handle some of the redirects, it basically serves as the UI wrapper so that you don't have to build your own custom UI for auth. This is provided by Firebase right out of the box. If you want to use it, it's a third party, it's like an extra library that you can include if you want. The configuration is pretty straightforward. You can either use a pop-up or a redirect type of sign-in flow. You can decide, once I sign in, do I have a success URL where I want to go with that? And then you can configure different providers. So each of the providers that we've enabled on the front end doesn't mean anything if we don't also add it here. So in this case, we've customized them a little bit. If I had just done this, let's see. I could just do it like this, and this would enable Google with all the defaults. But the way we've done it here by providing the object and then given it a specific provider, now I can customize it. And the custom parameters here is that I want to always allow them to select an account, even if only one account is currently available. And that's because Google does a really great job of multi-account setup. And for example, everybody on my team has at least 2 Google accounts because we use Google Workspaces for all of our work accounts, and then we all have our personal Google accounts. For the email, for example, I'm not going to require a display name to be provided. I could, and there's the email. We're also using a credential helper, Google YOLO. This is a credential helper is basically the thing that is helping your users remember how they logged into your app last. So when you've got a list of like 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 different authentication providers, maybe they come to your app once, they sign in using Google, and they come back the next time and they're like, man, how did I sign in? Did I sign in with Facebook? And then when you try to do it, it's going to tell you, no, you signed in with Google last time. Why don't you try that instead? And so the credential helpers are really useful. And so all I've done here is this is the configuration object. This configuration object is specific to Firebase UI. Firebase UI documentation will tell you how to do that. And then, because this is an Angular project, the way I have to enable that for my Angular project is I import the Firebase UI module and do the configuration, pass the configuration for root here. And now, Firebase UI is totally configured and ready to go. That was pretty easy. And even if doing this from scratch, literally all I have to do is npm install Firebase UI, write this, or literally copy it from the website. So just for fun, this is it, Firebase UI Angular. And there's probably similar packages for React and everything, or you can use the built-in JavaScript one. It's not that big of a deal. This is kind of what it's capable of looking like. And then there's instructions. So how to use, you can literally copy their entire configuration right out of here, paste that into your app, and it's a great starting point to be able to get going. Or you can look at additional information on the Firebase UI. So Firebase UI docs, again, Firebase docs are really pretty good. So here I am, Firebase UI, here's a getting started guide. You can use a CDN, you can do the npm module. If you're still using Bower, anything like that, right? And here's how you'd set up in a vanilla.js project, for example. And then you've got the documentation of how to do the configurations with the different types of authentication systems. So that's all right there in their documentation. So now that we've done the setup on this, there's one other thing. I've got a login component, and this is literally all my login component is this. Basically, Firebase UI, the library, provided this Angular component for me, which I can just use. In the event of a failure, I need to handle that some way. So the component provides this handle error that's going to use a snack bar. to do things. That's it. We're done. That's because the UI is provided for us. That's all we've got to do. And here in this location, I want to disable auto sign in. I don't have to. This is an option, one of the options that Firebase UI provides. There are a few other options with Firebase UI as well. So there's a sign in success configuration that we could do here if we wanted to call a function on sign in success. I handle sign in success a little bit differently, and I'm going to show that to you here in just a second. This entire function basically exists in order to be able to, this entire component, sorry, exists in order to be able to do routing. So in my routing file, I have /login mapping to the login component. Now, there's another little thing that I'm doing here that's interacting with authentication. So let's show off some of this. So I've made it look super duper easy, but what I haven't really shown you is what do I do once they've logged in? How do I manage that login? And the answer is that we have an auth service that we have created here. And so this auth service is going to use the Angular Fire Auth or our Firebase authentication in order to do something with authentication. What I'm actually doing is simply using the auth state observable that is provided to me by Angular Fire Auth, and I am reacting to any changes. And so I'm using a switch map to take that Firebase user, which can either be null or a full user object. And if it's null, and I'm doing two things. First thing I'm doing is mapping it to my own profile object. I'm enriching the user profile a little bit, and then I'm storing that for access within my application. The other thing, though, that I'm doing is responding to the fact that somebody has logged in. So if I've already built a custom profile, I'm just going to return the custom profile. Otherwise, I'm going to build a brand new profile. What building a profile looks like in my case is I'm grabbing the user ID and display name right out of the user object that Firebase provides me, and I'm also going to create an avatar URL. Some login methods will have an avatar URL, some won't. So email and password don't provide an avatar. Social logins usually do of some kind, and it's provided as a photo URL in the Firebase user object. So if I don't have an avatar URL, probably means I've logged in via email, but that's fine. What I'm going to do is use that email address to build a gravatar URL, and that'll become my default avatar. Then if I don't have a display name, but I have an email address, I'm going to actually build a username from the part of the email address that before the @ symbol, right? And so I'll do that really quickly. And if for some reason I don't have an email address, maybe because I used a phone-based authentication, for example, and I'm not able to build that, I'm actually going to call this anonymous. I can just create a default user. I can do whatever I want. Point is, this is my code. This is just an example of how I can take the Firebase user, build my own custom profile with it in reaction to somebody logging in, because I'll only have a user object once an authentication has occurred. And observables are a great way of managing that. So I'll build my custom profile. I'll hang on to that so that I don't build it again in case this observable gets updated with the same user again and again, which can happen as we, for example, if they were to reload the page, do a shift reload of the application, this would load back up. But so we've got the DB collection. So in this particular case, I'm actually going to write that profile out of the database. So this is an example of how we write data using Firestore. So I'm grabbing a Firestore reference. I'm using the users collection. I'm adding a new document based upon their user ID. And let me show you what that looks like in the code. Sorry. There we go. Nope. There it is. Too many windows. All right. So when I come out here to Firestore, once somebody's logged in based on their UID, it's going to come in right here. So this is me logging in through one of my email addresses. This is the user ID of the user, and then this is the profile object that got created. And I'm storing those in the database because one thing that I cannot do inside of an app is view the authentication of the user object information for somebody that is not currently logged in, right? So I save this here so that I have a list of my users and some of their information if I need it. You can start to build up a rich user profile showing their activity and the way they've done things in your application if you want. So this is just an example of how we would do that. So again, this is not strictly required, but it is something that is really helpful to be able to do. So I am already running npm start in the background. You can run npm start or ngserve on your own. And now what you'll notice is on localhost 4200, oops, I'm going to close that one. Localhost 4200. Now on my login screen, I get these options. And I can actually keep that console open so we can see if anything happens. I'm going to log in using my Google account. And boom, I'm logged in. Now I'm in the chat room. Because I've logged in, some things have changed. Let me show you how that worked really quickly. In the app component right here, I have a menu, bulleted list, right? No big deal. What I'm doing is ngIf user async or null. So in the case that there is no user, right, the user is null, I'm going to provide a login link and nothing else. All the other things are hidden behind the user object existing. And I'm doing that in the app component because I'm literally watching just the auth state on Angular Fire auth. This is an observable that provides the user object. So that's a really easy way of being able to, observables are a great way of kind of wherever you are in your code, being able to have access to what the user object looks like, what the user is doing. Now, let's say I want to send a message. I can't do that. That's not connected yet. So let's look at that. So in order to be able to actually view chats, we're going to need to use the database. So let's talk really quickly, real-time versus Firestore. Real-time database is the original Firebase database. You'll still hear it called just Firebase sometimes, or Firebase database. The official name now is RTDB, or real-time database. It can support now up to 200,000 concurrent users. That's 200,000 users reading and writing the exact same bit of data at the same time, which is quite a lot. It is a pure JSON data store, which means every node that you grab out of the database is a JSON object. And we can actually see that when we go into the console here. If I go to the real-time database, for example, I'll use this little location. If I click on this, I'm going to export this as JSON, and I open up this file. It's literally just a JSON object. I can even re-upload that. I can import a JSON file, and it'll just dump it right here, and it'll replace whatever's at this node with that JSON file. So it's a pure JSON data store, which is pretty cool. Very, very lightweight SDK to work with. Does have some offline capabilities for mobile. It is definitely real-time. Pricing is interesting. The pricing is based on storage and downloads. Now it's it's a lot more expensive than Firestore for storage, but it only charges you for the amount you're storing and the amount of data that you download. Firestore charges a lower amount for storage, but then it charges for egress from Google's backplane. Basically, if it leaves the Google data center, then you charge. But inside the data center, you don't get charged for egress. Reads, writes, and deletes, though, you do get charged based upon total activity. So if you do a lot of reads and writes, but not a lot of download, there may be a price difference for you. Firestore, though, supports 1 million concurrent users. That's enough for a lot of different types of applications, just right out of the gate without having to do anything terribly special. It'll be up to you to decide what that threshold means for your application. What does a concurrent user look like? But it handles a lot of traffic right out of the gate before you have to do anything special to try to manage that. Instead of being purely JSON, it is a series of documents and collections, more of a document database. There are path-based rules that work really, really well. It's a little bit heavier weight SDK, although the new SDK that is being released is tremendously better in terms of overall options for weight. So in the real-time database, if you have a JSON structure, this is what our database might look like, because you would have just a pure JSON. So you'd have our application here at the top that says Fireside, and then you'll have the chats, which is just a list of objects that are indexed by key. So there's no such thing as a true array in Firebase, although you can return data as arrays. It'll treat this as an array if you want to, using their API. But it's really an object that is indexed by a key. And then you can have your JavaScript object, your JSON content in there. Users same way. In Firestore, we have a series of collections. So chats is a collection. A collection is an array. It's an array of things that have IDs, which is the document ID, and then properties, document properties. You can have one or more documents inside of each of these collections. So you can have as many top-level collections as you want with these different documents. Document, though, can also have sub-collections, and so you can actually build some pretty interesting things. So let's say, for the sake of argument, underneath this user document, I would like to have a collection of the user's chats. I could totally do that. You need to be very careful about your naming and how you choose to name things, because any collection or sub-collection that shares the same name, regardless of where it's located, how it's nested inside of other documents, can be queried simultaneously using a collection group query. And we're not going to show the collection group query today, but it's an interesting side effect when you're trying to structure your database. So when we want to use the SDK to read from the database, we're going to set things up like this. If we're using the generic JavaScript API, it looks like this. We're going to use the global Firebase object that they provide to grab a Firestore reference. We're going to use that Firestore reference to grab a collection of chats, and then we're going to retrieve that using a GET. And we're going to wait for that, because that is a promise-based API. And then that snapshot is going to contain a list of documents that we can kind of loop through. So this would just print out the data in each of those documents. Using Angular Fire, which is what we're using in our project, this is a little bit different. You would inject Angular Firestore as an object, and that's already configured. And then we're going to do this collection chats and then value changes, which is an observable subscription. We're going to subscribe to this observable value changes. So anytime the data changes, we're going to get the values of that data, and we're subscribed to it like this. So those are two different ways of reading. If you want to do writing, if we've got like a chat object here, using the vanilla JavaScript API, again, you grab that Firestore reference, you load that collection, and then you add a new document to the collection. And in the case of calling add, it will generate its own unique key for that object as part of that add. Using Angular Fire is very, very similar. It's just a .add. In both of those cases, they're returning a promise to let you know when that add operation is complete. So there's one little thing that I forgot to show you earlier, and I want to show that off right now as far as how we've set up this application. So if I go into the app module, one thing you're always going to need to do is call initialize app with your Firebase configuration. If you're following along, you probably realize that we didn't do that. And so I apologize for that mistake. Let's fix that right now. The way I'm doing that in this particular application is a little bit unique. This is the Angular way of initializing the application. This initialize app exists in Firebase. So let's do a thing really quickly. If I go into my project and I look at my application right here, if I create a brand new project from scratch, you're going to actually need to create your very own web app. So you'll create an app. You're going to click web app in this case, and you're going to go through the steps to do that. I already have one right here. And what you're going to notice when you create one is it's going to give you this configuration value. So you'll be able to copy and paste these. This is the configuration object that goes right here. Okay, there's another way we can do that though, and let me show you this here. If I could type, it would really help. So I have actually created a script for this, but Firebase Apps SDK config web. This will actually print out the configuration stuff for the project you're currently working in. What you're going to need to do is put this into a file. So what I have done in this particular case is I've created a file, Firebase config JSON, and because you're working on my project, you can do this. And you're going to paste your own, you're going to create this file, and you're going to put your very own project configuration in here, just like this. And in our core module, sorry, not in our core module, in our app module, it's already importing and looking for that JSON file. And so all we have to do is copy out of either using the command line or copy it out of the app settings here. And that is what we need in order to be able to connect to our Firebase project. So as you can see, I've got that right there in my Firebase config JSON. This file has been added to the git ignore. And the reason I do that, of course, is so that I don't commit all my Firebase configuration data to a public repository, because this is a public repo that you all have access to. It's worth noting, however, that it's not really a security consideration. These things, yes, obviously we would love to be able to keep these secure, private, and protected if we wanted to, but it's not really possible. And the reason it's not possible is that this is a web app. Those values, no matter how we do it, are ultimately going to end up on our user's browser. They are going to have access to it. It's just a matter of how much effort they have to go into to be able to find this connection information, right? But it will be public eventually. Because of that, obscuring this is great, but there's no security around not showing this stuff. There is a certain level of security of me not publishing it to a GitHub where people can really, really easily troll me based upon finding that. I don't want to do that. But ultimately, there's no security in protecting this in your app because it's going to the user anyway. There's other security options that we have, and I'm going to show you a couple of those as we go through this. So we got this up and running. I added a couple things, so let's go through and actually do the real work. So I've got a chat room right here, and the chat room does all the things that it needs to do to be able to save things, and what it's using is this chat service. So if we go to chat service, this chat service right here is where we're going to do all the real work. So I've got my code right here. What I'm doing is, instead of returning null, I'm going to return this.db, which is my Firestore handle, .collection of chats. In my case, I'm also adding the second optional parameter in order to sort them by timestamp. And then I'm returning the observable. I'm actually doing a pipe map because I want to convert these from what the data that I had in Firestore to my own custom chat object, which includes some user data and things. So once I've done that and saved it, you'll note things start showing up, right? Boom. I have data now, just by virtue of the fact that I enabled these two lines of code. And the reason is that this service function is being called from my component. But I still can't write anything, okay? So in order to write something, I need to be able to save a chat. All right, and we're gonna do that. And now, what I'm doing is calling the DB collection, just like we talked about before. And this is a TypeScript thing that's really useful. In both of these cases, I can tell TypeScript what data type that collection contains, and then it'll do some type checking for me, which is really, really nice. But I'm just grabbing a collection and then saying I want to add a new object to it, and then I pass along the object of data that I want. And this is the data that I'm passing in. It includes my user data and the content that I'm adding. So now that I've done that, this is auto reloading because I ran npm start. And now I can write something, but here's the amazing part. Look at that. it automatically shows up. Now, what I got to tell you is that there's nothing in my code that's going to make that show up other than the fact that I just did a round trip to Firebase. I added something to Firebase, and because this list is an observable, it's a listener, it's getting real-time updates, and so it's automatically populating right here into my chat room right away, immediately. All I had to do is write basically 2 lines of code, one to watch that collection for changes, and the other to write a new object into that collection. But chats aren't very interesting if we don't have images, and as you can see here, I have an image, right? I was able to upload an image. So let's get to where we can actually upload images as well. So Firebase storage, there's an SDK for being able to create things. The upload is basically, you grab a reference to the Firebase storage SDK, and then you're going to upload the file. It's a put at a specific file location. That's it. It's a file, very, very simple file system. Once you've uploaded things, you have access to the metadata of the file, when it was created, the download URL for people to be able to access it. When you're doing an upload, you're going to see that I'm using the promise so that I would just wait till the whole thing's done and then I move on with my life. But there's also an observable that's returned when you are uploading a file, so that you can actually provide like a real-time progress bar, for example, of what percentage of the file has been uploaded. There's a lot of really cool things you can do. It's cancelable, so you can actually provide a cancel button. So if somebody's sitting there waiting for something to upload, they can actually cancel that operation. A lot of different things you can do. The SDK is really rich as far as what it allows you to do. In order to be able to do this, we're going to come in again to my chat service, and let me show you where this is coming from really quickly. In the chat room component, I have a toggle that allows them to switch between the text input here for content or the file input control. So this is just a type file, accepts anything with image slash. And it's going to use this select image event if they change something. So let's look at what that looks like in the code. If they select an image, it's an event, so it's an event target files, and this is actually the list of files that were selected from the file input control. And if they selected any, the length is greater than 0, I have a file, and I'm actually going to patch that value onto the form so that the form will contain an image. And that is the file selection work. Once that contains an image, when they click the submit button, right? So I have a send button here, which is a submit button, which triggers the submit function on the form here to send chat. It's going to call the send chat, which is going to determine if I have content or image. And if I have an image, it's going to send, and that image has a file name. That's important to make sure that it's not just bogus data. Then I'm going to pass in the image. Otherwise, I'm going to pass in the content. So this is either going to upload the file through this, or it's going to pass on the text that they typed in the text box, along with the current user object. Again, none of this is Firebase stuff. It's just some basic Angular stuff. But once I've done that, that chat service is what does the magic. So in this particular case, all it's doing is saving the chat if it's content and going on about your life. And the save chat, by the way, is automatically handling. If this is type string, we're saving it. Otherwise, we're making it empty. So if we upload an image, this content text is just going to be an empty string. So let's handle the upload. So the first thing we need to do is determine a file location. So this is on our Google bucket, storage bucket file system. In that file system, we're going to have an images folder. Underneath that images folder, we're going to have user ID. And underneath that user ID, we're going to have the chat ID, and then there's going to be the file, just the normal file name, whatever they uploaded. And the reason we're putting the file name underneath this unique ID is so that we don't have to deal with naming collisions. If somebody uploads the file with the same name multiple times, but they're different files, they just happen to have the same name, there's not going to be any collisions because we're keeping each of those underneath a directory related to the chat based upon the ID that was created when it created the chat. So that's a really useful way of creating file space. It's also really important to have a user ID space because we're going to do that for security permissions here in a minute. When we upload the image, it's literally grab the file system and we're going to upload it. This is the file. This is actually the image file because it's an instance of file type. That's the file, and that's the place it's going in our file system. We're waiting for it. When it's done, we have a snapshot. One of the things we can do with that snapshot is create a download URL. That returns a promise. We'll have the URL here. Now I'm going to have to update our existing chat to include that image URL. And I'm going to go ahead and update the text to include the file name and indicate that we have a user-provided image. So now that I've saved this, let's look at what happens when I actually do something really quickly. Let's choose a file. This is fun. I have been doing some extra life streaming recently. Boom, there's the background. It just shows up right there. It says user provided image. There's the file name. There's the image right there in the chat. Okay, and now when I come in here and we go into our storage bucket, actually, let me look at my authentication. So I'm currently logged in as this ID, this Google account. So I'm going to copy my UID right here. Now I'm going to go into storage. I'm going to go here, and this is me. And one of these 3 chats should be, nope, that's not it. There it is, blue grid pattern. There's the file, right? There's a preview of it. I can see it here. I could delete it. I can click on it. I can see the metadata for it, right? All that right here. So I can manage this in the console. I can see it out here, and we're able to upload files just by toggling back and forth there. Cool. All right. So we're really getting close to the end now. One of the things we want to be able to do is Firebase hosting. We want to be able to deploy this. Firebase hosting is super fast. It's super convenient. I love it. Just static files, push it out. You type in Firebase deploy on the command line. It pushes all your files out, and you have access to them. So one thing that we're going to do, I've already deployed the app. So I'm going to let you go ahead and, rather than actually running the deploy right now, live deploys and demos are always risky. So I want you to use this URL to hop into the chat. So if you wouldn't mind, there it is. We can hop in here together. You'll be able to log in, and we can send chats. Please be kind in what you say. It's always risky opening up chats to public demo, but I look forward to hearing from you as you are able to log in using your Google account and chat back and forth in this chat room.
Okay, we'll give you some time. And I also pasted the link in the event chat, since most of the people are typing in the event. So no worries.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
So while we're waiting for that, I'm going to show off a couple things really quickly, and that is some security notes. So one of the things that we need to be able to do is secure our application, and rules are a big way we do that in Firebase. So this is a database rule for real-time database, and it's written in a JSON format, and basically what you have access to is read and write. You can write all kinds of really complex expressions, but in this particular case, in order to write to a user's profile, they have to be authenticated as somebody that has that user ID. So basically, this means a user can only write to their own profile, not to anybody else's, but anybody who's logged in can read the profile. Chats, the way they're written, is that anybody who's authenticated can read and write chats, but you have to be authenticated in order to do that. I could add additional data integrity checks here as well. This is just a really simple example. Firestore has a totally different flavor of security rules, but they're a lot easier to read and write. What this does is allows me to match a pattern. So chats is the collection, and then any documents under there And I have a little bit more granularity as well. So allow reading, creating, and updating, but no deletions if you're authenticated. And then down here for the users, again, anybody who's authenticated can read it, but you can only write it if your current authentication, if you're currently authenticated as the user with that UID, because we can use variables in the path. So this variable represents the document ID that matches that UID. And this is the data right here that we're kind of basing this off of. And so, hey, we have people. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Very exciting. So let's look at the security really quickly. We have, in our case, we have a Firestore rules, and I have these already written, but I wanted to show them off, right? So we've got read, create, update. If you're authenticated, so we just walk through those. And then also for storage. So the storage rules and the Firestore rules follow the exact same type of format. In the Firestore case, we have the service is cloud.firestore, and then we go through this. In the storage rules, it's slightly different. We're matching on a bucket. So it's firebase.storage, and then we're matching. This is the default bucket. If you have multiple buckets in your storage, you can put those names in here. Inside of that, I'm looking for images, user ID, and then any other pathing that I have. Anything underneath that's going to match. And what this means is that a user can only write to images underneath their own user ID when they're authenticated, but anybody who's authenticated can read. And this is actually strictly speaking not necessary. I could actually change this to be the same thing here, because we're using a public download URL in the chat application itself. But this is just an example of the rules. One of the great things about this rule syntax is you can actually create functions and call functions inside of your rules. So if you've got a lot of different document patterns or file storage patterns that all need to apply the same rule set, you can actually create a function once that generates the rules, and then you can map that to a lot of different URLs and paths. And so the rules there are really great. These rules, I love it. Minions. So the rules are really, really important though, because the way you set the rules is a large percentage of the security of your Firebase application. So spending time getting that right, really, really very important. Another thing we're going to go over is cloud functions. Cloud functions are serverless. They can be written in JavaScript or TypeScript. You've got a lot of different triggers and endpoints and things. So let me show you a couple. We're going to write two really quickly. So under the functions folder, because I enabled functions on this project, we've got some source code. So I've got, the way I set up my functions is the main index file. I just export from all my different functions folders. In this case, I've got a functions folder with an index file. So each file, I'm going to export from each one of those. Let's create two functions really quickly. This one is going to replace LOL with a laughing emoji. That's all it's going to do. This is the name that it's going to have in the Firebase console, and this is how I set it up. So functions.firestore, and I'm going to map to a specific document, and the pattern is chats followed by a chat ID. And then I'm going to subscribe to an event. The event I care about is on create. So when you create that chat initially, I'm going to do some processing on it. The snapshot returns the data at that location after the create has happened. The context has additional information, which includes, for example, the ability to grab this chat ID in the params. So context params chat ID is going to be the ID of the chat that was created. The snapshot is the data. So the way I grab that is this .data object will return the data. It's a promise, so I need to wait for it. And I'm going to map it, because I'm in TypeScript land, I'm going to map that to a specific chat. So now this chat contains a chat object. If there's content text, I'm going to replace LOL in either uppercase or lowercase with the laughing emoji. And then I'm going to use the reference of the snapshot. So the snapshot is this chat object, I'm going to grab the database reference to that, and I'm going to call update. And I'm going to update just the content text, right? And we're going to make that change. One thing that's really important anytime you are in a trigger-based function like this one, where I'm responding to an action of writing to the database, I must always return a promise. And in this particular case, if there is no content text, I'm going to just promise.resolve. In other words, I have nothing to do here, have a promise to resolve. In the other case, the promise is returned by the update operation itself. You always return a promise because that's how the Firebase platform knows that the function is done running. Now, this has actually already been deployed. So just for fun, if you type something like that, it's going to take a second to run, and then it's going to actually replace what I typed with the emojis. I love the cats. The next function that we're going to do is a search function. And this is going to be an HTTP endpoint. So again, this is the function name. So functions.https on request is a normal HTTP endpoint. There's also a callable, which is for functions that are intended to be used within the Firebase ecosystem. But this can be public and be used from anywhere. And now you have a traditional express endpoint. So we have a request and a response object. I'm going to go ahead and set my CORS here to avoid any problems, my CORS header. And then I'm going to decide what kind of query. If we have an email, we're looking for an email. I'm expecting an email parameter and the URL. And so if that's a string, awesome. Otherwise, it'll be null. If I don't have an email, if this is empty, blank, whatever, I'm just going to return a 400. Otherwise, I'm going to try to do a search by that email address. The first thing I'm going to do is use the admin SDK. And the admin SDK kind of bypasses some of the security rules, and I've done an initialize up here. This just says whatever app I'm currently running in, let's use that. Admin SDK is very similar to the client SDK we used in the front end. I have access to all kinds of things. I'm going to use the auth to look somebody up by their user ID or by their email and return the user record. That user record is going to contain a UID. So grab the user record based on that email. I'm going to use that email to search. So I grab the Firestore, I'm going to look through the chats collection, and now I'm going to do a query where the UID on the chat is equal to the UID of the person I just searched for. I'm going to order by the timestamp so that I get the chats in the order that I expect. I'm going to map those to a specific type of chat record here. And then I'm going to just return that with a status 200. If any error occurs, which would be like I can't find a user, I can't perform the search, something bad happens, I'm just going to return the error message. That's it. It's a very simple endpoint, and that's going to allow me to enable this from the front end. So let's go ahead and enable this from the front end. We have back in our chat service, instead of returning null here, we're going to call /API/search. We're going to pass an email in. So this enables the search box to do something. It's going to do a normal HTTP GET to that URL, and it's going to return the results. Interesting side note. Let's look at how this URL maps to our function. So remember in our Firebase JSON, this is the main configuration file. I have this rewrite here. You'll notice that that URL pattern that I just copied, it's right here. So one of the things I can do in a rewrite is say that /API/search maps to this function name. Where did we find this function name? That's right. That's the export name from our search function. Okay. So when I go into the Firebase functions here, you can see I've deployed these functions already. So I have this function by name here. And this is the URL that it would normally be published under. And I would have to track this URL. All right, let's do this thing. So I would have to, oh, that's interesting. Oh, it's running. So there's all the chats that I've run, okay? So I would have to keep track of this URL by environment, whichever environment I'm in. If I have multiple projects that I deploy this to, I've got to keep track of all that. What I can do instead, so this is the chat URL that we're using the chat in. It's going to allow me to replace this custom URL that I don't want to know about with this. And it's going to allow me to replace my function name with API/search, okay? And now it does the same thing. Okay, so it means that now I can, whatever domain I'm on, I can just call /API/search, which is why I was able to get away with in the code having my URL. This is an absolute URL relative to my project, right? And this totally works. So because I have already deployed these functions, as we can see here, this works in here. Exactly, we've got those LOLs. Now I can go to the search and I can type, and it returns the list of my chats. You can type in, if you go to search, you can type in your own email address, somebody else's. Right, and there's the two things that I did during the demo, right? And I can do a search and it looks up just those things, and it's using that HTTP endpoint for that. So let's ignore that for a minute. Let's go to the network. If I search with nothing, it's actually going to throw 400. It's never going to do its thing. That's fine. If I do a search of my email address, boom, now we see that it called that URL and returned that result. So I already did that API search. So there's a number of other things Firebase can do: analytics, crash reporting, cloud messaging. It's super cross-platform. Firebase Cloud Messaging, by the way, is probably the best push notification system on the planet. It's a really great way to manage those things. So that's really it. We can walk through the demo more if you want. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer that. But that's kind of a really quick introduction to how to get up and running and get started with Firebase. And thank you all so much for playing along and helping out with the chat and writing back and forth. That was super fantastic.
Well, thanks, Michael. Well, that app turned out super cool. And I really enjoyed the ease you made it with. And I think really audience did too. So are there any questions from the audience? I see there are a lot of people here, but they are kind of shy, I think. So, yeah, we'll just give them a few seconds.
Totally. One of the comments I see is it sounds very easy, but I'm afraid it's not once you start working on it. That's a fair statement. What's interesting is that I'm honestly blown away by how much really is easy, and it stays easy. The authentication, for example, I have spent years of my life probably dealing with adding authentication to applications over the years, but with Firebase, it really is just as easy as what you saw here. And so setting up this project from scratch with the HTML and CSS and everything took a few hours, sure, mostly because I'm really slow at UI. But setting up the authentication component of this project from scratch took me about 15 minutes total. And for that same amount of effort, you can add Firebase and Twitter and Apple and all these different authentication methods you want to your application. And it's all just baked in. And so the things that get harder with Firebase as you work with it more are still less hard than a lot of the other alternatives are sometimes. So I still really love working with it.
Yeah, okay. So for how long have you been working with Fireside? Was it from the day one
No, I've been working with Firebase since just before the Google acquisition. So what, 2014? Actually, technically Google had bought them, but they hadn't really transitioned on the Google platform yet. So about 2014 timeframe. So it's been a few years now.
Yeah, like
We
7
got,
months.
yeah, right. So we got started with the real-time database, and then slowly added different capabilities. I use Firebase hosting now for everything. It's the only static hosting provider I use. One of the things about Firebase is that if you have a really small, like a personal project, personal website or whatever, the free plan is really generous. And you can host your own personal website on Firebase hosting probably for free. And it is fast. It is unbelievably fast. It is fast globally. They use CDNs to help accelerate it, and it is a wonderful hosting solution.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
One of the things I actually forgot to show on hosting, actually, you see that I had deployed this. If you ever deploy something and you're not super thrilled with it, you can actually right-click on it and roll back to a previous version. One click, done. You're back to the previous version now. It's nice.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, since I don't see any other questions, I don't know if you guys are shy or what's happening, but if you have any other questions, please send them to me, and we'll gladly send it back to Michael and see if we can help you out with it.
Absolutely.
So, Michael, thank you so much again for the great demo and for all the time again that you dedicated to our community. I really hope everyone enjoyed your presentation and that they found it useful. And for the ones who couldn't make it to the live event, we'll have it posted publicly on CODEstantine community website.